Good morning and welcome to Morning Java, brought to you as always by GetGo Cafe and Market, where right now, everyone, they're doing curbside delivery. If you need easy, safe, clean options to get quick food and good food and fresh food, go to GetGo Cafe and Market right now.
Absolutely, and you can always. They have a wide variety of stuff, much more than what you'd think. You know, Basically get anything you want.
Yeah, it's a great options to select. Now, we always provide great options for you at DK Pittsburgh Sports as far as content to read. But Dale has something special lined up all this week for you guys to enjoy. It's a 5-part special on Troy Polamalu. Listen, we spared you a 10-part documentary. So, Dale, talk to us about what your goal was going into this project and all the work that you kind of put into this to set it up.
Yeah, when I talked to Troy after his Hall of Fame induction, or when it was announced that he was going in the Hall of Fame, and just talking to him a little bit during that period, I started thinking about it. And I'm like, we really don't know a lot about Troy Polamalu off the field. Everybody knows what he was on the field. Everybody saw his career, but he's always been kind of a man of mystery, an international man of mystery. And so I wanted to dig deeper into that and find out more about, Troy, the man. I think we have some ideas. We all have our preconceived notions about him. But I wanted to go back to the beginning and find out, about Troy Polamalu's beginnings in football, beginnings in life, and just do some of that. And then it led me down the path of, talking to his uncle, Kennedy Polamalu, and talking to different teammates, and of course, talking to Troy and those kind of things. So it was really been working on that story for quite some time now, a couple of months really. And it's just been kind of sitting there, and I didn't know when to run it. This kind of would have been the week that they would have had mini camp. Why not this week?
Yeah, not this week. Now, I think that's very interesting. How did you break it up? Like, you did 5 parts. Did you do specifically just by the times of his career and life and how he's gone into here, or did you kind of break it up by maybe different kind of topics of challenges that he faced, or some of the insight that he was giving?
When I started writing it, I wasn't sure how I was going to break it up, and so I wrote the first part, and it was like 2,600 words, and I'm like, that's way too much. So I said, okay, we're going to break this off and split this up when he went to USC, or I'm sorry, when he made the move to go with his aunt and uncle. Then I decided to change that. I added that back to the first part and put it back. Now, for the second part is when he goes to USC and his career there and everything that happened there. And I really didn't touch too much on his accomplishments with the Steelers. I think we all saw that.
Right.
We all knew what that was, but I wanted to, do that and then kind of get into life after football with the final 2 parts of the whole thing. I did discuss, I did do a little bit more. Like the third part is more about his first year, him being drafted in his first year with the Steelers. But then I kind of, let the next 11 to 12 years go, and we'll pick it up, after football and go with that.
That's very interesting. So again, reminder to everyone, you can read this 5-part series that Dale Lally has put together on dkpittsburghsports.com over Troy Polamalu's life, just to give people a sense of like the kind of inside look that you're giving on the Polamalu's life. Because like you said, we haven't had, but could you give us like a quick like take, or like a story that you got that was like, wow, that spoke out to you? You said, I have to use this as part of one of my parts in this.
Yeah, he talked a lot. When I talked to him, he mentioned, I asked him, how did you get into football? When did you start playing? And he talked about playing in his front yard with his brother, who's older than him. And when he's like 7 or 8 years old, and they would go and take on other people in their neighborhood. This was when he still lived in Los Angeles before he made the move to 10 Mile, Oregon. And he and his brother, who was about 10 years or so older than him, would go play some of the other teenagers in their neighborhood, and they would always win. And he pretended he was Walter Payton, not surprisingly, Walter Payton, because he felt, Walter Payton was a humble, kind of guy that he might want to look up to. So he told me that, he always pretended that they were playing at Soldier Field.
Wow.
And, he said the funny thing is, he never got a chance to play at Soldier Field in his 14-year career. The one time that the one time that he could have played at Soldier Field, he was hurt, and that's the only field that he never played on in his career. And that was the one that he played on throughout his childhood. In his mind, he was always playing at Soldier Field.
Wow, that's some amazing stuff like there. If you want more of that, check out Dale's series on Troy Polamalu only on DKPittsburghSports.com all week. Okay, Dale. So last week you did a ranking around the AFC North of the running back position, not just the individual players, but also where the teams rank. Now, we know this could be a soft spot for a lot of Steelers fans because there was a lot of outcry when they didn't draft a running back with their first pick. They came in the second round. But where did you see when you look around the division, there does seem to be a good amount of talent at this position. Where did you see like the best talent, and explain why you decided on your rankings that you settled on?
Chris, the ironic thing is if you look at the AFC North, there are 4 running backs in the division who have been to the Pro Bowl.
Yeah.
And I think the best running back in the division has never been to the Pro Bowl. I think Joe Mixon's the best running back in the division talent-wise, and he has yet to go to a Pro Bowl, largely because he's been playing behind a really bad Cincinnati Bengals offensive line. But I really look at him and say, he's a top, 4 or 5 back in the league. But that kind of gives you an idea of the depth at the position in the division. When you look at, you've got Mixon, you've got Nick Chubb in Cleveland, you got Kareem Hunt in Cleveland, you got Mark Ingram, with Baltimore, and they also draft J.K. Dobbins. I don't know how you can legitimately look at that and say, yeah, you can't say that the Steelers have a better running back situation than any of those teams.
I agree with that assessment, especially Joe Mixon was a guy, like, coming into his draft, athletically, there was no question how good he could be. The problem was the off-the-field issues, specifically because he had a woman on camera. But, you look at Nick Chubb and the consistency that he brought to that position for the Browns and just the athletic talent that he has there and the fact that he's backed up, like you said, by Kareem Hunt. Those are 2 dangerous guys who could be number 1 starting running backs in the NFL and not just produce on a fantasy level, but win you football games. And then, like you said, Mark Ingram, the guy that was kind of the leader of the backfield when it came to the Ravens, and they have all the speed on the field. That's the guy that could pound you and grind you in the serious goal line situations, and even beyond that. I agree with your assessment. The Steelers, you had so everyone knows we're talking about. You had, as your individual rankings, you had Mixon as the number 1 back in the division, Chubb at 2, Hunt at 3, Ingram at 4, and James Conner at 5. I thought that was interesting. And then as far as your teams, you had the Browns at the best with Chubb, Hunt, Dontrell Hilliard, and Andy Janovich. You had the Bengals at 2 with Mixon and Bernard and Travion Williams and Samaje Perine. Then you had the Ravens at 3 with Ingram, Dobbins, Edwards, and Justice Hill, who some people, he also was a draft pick two years ago. And then you have the Steelers at 4 with, of course, Connor, Snell, Samuels, and McFarland and Derek Watt.
Some people might look at that and say, how could you have the Ravens so low? They set an NFL record for rushing record last year.
It was Lamar Jackson.
But Lamar Jackson had 1,200 yards of it. And I'll tell you, I really looked at Ingram and Connor, and Connor might be a slightly better player than Ingram in terms of his all-around game. Ingram's okay catching the ball, but that's not his forte.
He's not dynamic there, no.
I think if you took James Conner and put him in that Ravens run game, he would be highly productive as well. But you have to factor in Connor's injury issues. And so he's the only back in the division of those top 5 that's never had a 1,000-yard season. So, you think about that as well. There's a lot of talent at that position in the AFC North.
Do you foresee, last question on this, do you foresee any chance that this year will be a changing of how the Pittsburgh running backs have been without Le'Veon Bell? Because Steelers fans, there's been a lot of talk about balancing the offense so Ben Roethlisberger doesn't have to throw for 5,000 yards again. Do you see there's a chance with either Connor or one of the younger backs in Snell or McFarland stepping up and saying, hey, this is a little more dynamic of a running back group than we thought they would, that people thought they would be?
I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Mike Tomlin is not a guy who likes to use a backs by committee approach unless he absolutely has to. I think ideally they'd like Connor to grab the bull by the horns and be that guy. You know, if he can get back to being 2018 James Conner, they would love it. That would be great. But I think McFarland gives them a definite change of pace, whereas Snell is more of, you know, kind of the same kind of runner as Connor. You know, perhaps we'll see what he brings to the table as a receiver. But McFarland gives them a guy who can make guys miss, and that's something that they, you know, and then run away from people.
Right.
And that's something they haven't had, you know, for quite some time. We'll see how that plays out.
Okay, Dale. So you were asked this by CBS Sportsline. So I'm giving a little bit of a preview of your answers to these, but you were asked 3 interesting questions on Steelers history as a historian on the team and a beat writer on the team. You were asked your top 3 Steelers of all time, the best quarterback that the team has ever had of all time, and the best coach. Now, these are interesting because the team has a whole bunch of Hall of Famers. I believe they have the most Hall of Famers that have ever come via the NFL draft in the league. There's other teams with more technical Hall of Famers, but through the draft, they have the most. And then, of course, you've got 2 legendary quarterbacks and 3 coaches that have won Super Bowls over the span of the past 50 years. Dale, let's start with the top 3. Who are your top 3 Steelers of all time, and how do you pick between those?
Well, that's the tough thing, Chris. And you know, when you look at the Steelers as a franchise, you know, with more than 20 Hall of Famers, all of which have come in the last, you know, other than the Ernie Stautners and guys like that, most of those Hall of Famers have come in the last 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's tough to kind of discern between those guys. But I think when I look at this, and every time I'm asked about this, I think there are 2 guys to me who stand apart from everybody else, and that's Joe Green and that's Mel Blount. I think they are the top 2 players in team history in that order, because they were both. When you look at Joe Green, he changed the trajectory of the franchise. He's the cornerstone.
Mm-hmm.
But then you look at Mel Blount, and Mel Blount was the guy who, you know, I mean, he was a defensive player of the year.
Mm-hmm.
He was, you know, the Mel Blount rule was put in place because of Mel Blount just, you know, beating the snot out of receivers down the field. So I think those 2 have to be up top. And then when you look at that third guy, I mean, there are 20 different guys that you can put in that spot. When I did it for CBS Sportsline, I believe I put Ben Roethlisberger in that third spot. But I was asked the same thing by Steelers.com a few weeks ago, and I went with Rod Woodson in that third spot. Again, there's so many different ways that you can go with that, and it's hard to go wrong when you have such a storied history.
Now, I agree with that sentiment. Joe Green, to me, always has to be number 1. I agree with that assessment. Mel Blount, I hear even Rod Woodson praise that guy. Like, there was a time I remember seeing him on a panel with, you know, other players like, you know, Warren Sapp, and then even some of the Ravens that he played with. And they said, well, who's the best defense? And he says that defense, because Mel Blount's the best corner I've ever watched play on tape. And when they were like, whoa, really? You say that about him? And he's like, yeah, I pay respect to that guy. So I find that interesting. But let's lead that into the second part. You put Ben as the third best player of all time in one of those. What puts him over Terry Bradshaw? Because there's a lot of people that say, well, look at the rings. Look at his clutch factor in the fourth quarter of those Super Bowls. He threw a touchdown in all 4 of those. What puts Ben over Terry for you? Is it just the stats portion? Because people point to Terry Bradshaw's stats and they say, I'm not so sure about that guy.
Yeah, you know, it's a tough question, and I think that, to me, if I look at it, and Bradshaw had a great arm and you know, just a cannon, but I look at Ben's longevity. He's been able to do it much longer. And I look at the beginning of his career as well, and Bradshaw in his first 4 seasons was a part-time player.
Yeah.
Even on that first Super Bowl team, he was a part-time player, didn't win the starting job until midway through the season.
Mm-hmm.
That's a factor for me. So when you look at Terry Bradshaw's career, it was really only about 8 years of really greatness. And, you know, I look at Roethlisberger's career, and he's going into his 15th season. You know, I also think that Ben Roethlisberger might be one of the most underrated throwers of the football in NFL history. I mean, I think when you look at his arm talent, it's right there with Bradshaw's in terms of the touch, the ability to throw the deep ball, all those things. And then you add in his ability to extend plays and do those kind of things. I just gave him the nod over Bradshaw.
I understand that sentiment. Now, the last question you were asked was the best coach. To me, that one's the easiest of the three because there's three coaches you could pick between, but only one of them has won multiple Super Bowls, and arguably, I always find this interesting, and maybe this is where we can go with the discussion with Chuck Noll. When people talk about great NFL coaches, I see those Mount Rushmore discussions that happen on great NFL coaches, but Chuck Noll consistently just seems like we forget that he existed, or at least people nationally forget that he existed. Why do you think that is? I mean, the guy won 4 Super Bowls and turned what was historically a laughingstock in the NFL into one of its greatest franchises.
I think the '80s happened.
Mm,
And, I think when you look at Chuck Noll's career, the '70s were amazing. One of the best runs of any team in the history of the game. And then the '80s weren't quite as kind to Chuck Noll. And I think there were some extenuating circumstances there. Guys got old. And at that time, you still didn't have free agency.
right.
And so you had to win through the draft. And when you're picking last in the draft year after year, it's going to catch up with you at some point. And that's what happened to the Steelers in the '80s. They also lost their advantage, that Bill Nunn provided them with the historically black colleges. That when they started getting guys from those historically black colleges in the late '60s and early '70s, everybody else said, hey, we can do that too. And so they started doing it, and all of a sudden that where you were getting the Mel Blunts and the John Stallworths and those type of players, all of a sudden now everybody else is starting to get them too. And so you see guys like Jerry Rice and Walter Payton
Yeah.
and guys of that nature coming from those historically black colleges, where the Steelers, if you look at that roster from the early part of the '70s where they were building that Super Bowl franchise, a good portion of those guys were coming from those black colleges.
I agree. Hey, HBCUs, I always love talking about my history with those as an alumnus of the first HBCU chain university. So I always think that's really special. But you bring up a good point about the '80s, and Noel even said it in the NFL Network special that they did on him when they did their biography documentary on him. And he said that, when the '80s were coming, he's like, we've been picking too low for too long. It's just we're going through a rough spell. But then he also said when he was retiring, he's like, we've put together some good pieces. He knew the '90s were going to be a big bounce back year, and Cowher inherited a solid squad, and he took them on to go to a Super Bowl, have some success. I still think even with the '80s, I understand your argument. And I understand you're not saying that he should be left off those lists, but that's just
no, absolutely not.
That's just where a lot of these national people, they forget about the greatness he had over 70s. So there's a very interesting point. Check out Dale's articles on Troy Polamalu that are coming out all throughout this week, and stay tuned with DKPittsburghSports.com as we continue to provide you all the coverage here on Pittsburgh Sports.